we are meeting at a time in which the United States and Iran have at least momentarily eschewed the idea of going to war and are talking. There is as we all know, I think, a deal that was worked out whereby the Iranians agreed to keep their enrichment of nuclear materials below a 20% level in return for the lifting of about $8 or $9 billion worth of the $60+ billion of sanctions over the next year. A second round of talks is about to move forward on that, and we therefore have some optimism about this. However, I will let Professor Abrahamian start and tell us why there may not be as much optimism as I just indicated. Professor?
Well, as you all know, the interim agreement has been agreed to, and I'm actually optimistic that within a year we'll get a full agreement. The danger comes, of course, from Congress and some irresponsible senators, including our own, who might try to throw a spanner into the works. But even here, I think they're not going to succeed. So on the whole, I'm optimistic that an agreement will be achieved within a year. Now, what's the reason for this optimism? I think the reason is that both administrations, the Obama administration and the Rouhani administration, are really on the same page on this issue. They're on the same page in that they're willing to come to a compromise, which would then actually settle the nuclear issue. Now, often it's become a mantra in the media that it's the sanctions that have forced Iran to come to the table and come to an agreement. This has been said so many times that it needs to be basically challenged. If you look at what the Iranian position, Iran was willing to come to a similar agreement years ago. In fact, the same person, Rouhani, and his now foreign minister, Zarif, offered very similar agreements to the Bush administration. And it was the Bush administration that refused to deal with them at that time. So the Iranian position has not changed. Even before sanctions, they were willing to come to an agreement on this issue. In fact, Jack Straw just recently, the former foreign minister of Britain, revealed that in his negotiations, he agreed with Rouhani with the settlement. The French foreign minister also agreed. The Bush administration vetoed it. And Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain, then reacted by dismissing actually Jack Straw. So that was basically the end of that agreement. So long before sanctions, the Iranian position was that they were willing to actually come to an agreement acceptable where they would not go into weaponization. So the question becomes, two questions is, what is the Iranian policy? And the second is, why has the US administration changed its position, i.e. contrasting the Obama administration to the Bush administration? I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what the Iranian policy is. The Iranian policy is not to have a nuclear weapons, not to have something at hand, but to have the capability that if ever they're again invaded and attacked as they were by Saddam Hussein, they would have the capability of deterrence. For them, the formative war experience was in 1988 when Saddam Hussein used actually chemical weapons on Iran, and the international community didn't raise a finger about it. In fact, the State Department said that this was all phony, the Iranians were making it up. And then when Iranians produced basically injured bodies in Germany for the hospitalization, the State Department argued, well, the Iranians had used it on themselves in order to get public international sympathy. In fact, they were taking Saddam Hussein off the hook. It wasn't until Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the day after that, the State Department admitted that, yes, the years before Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons on Iran. So from that experience, I think the Iranian elite believes that to have security in the long term, you should have the capability of being able to have a deterrence if need be. Of course, there is no immediate danger of Iran being invaded now, nor in the near future, but who knows in the long distance what will happen. In Iraq, you could very well have another Saddam Hussein, or even worse, a Shiite Saddam Alawi, who would be even more dangerous for Iran. So in the long-term security, I'm sure the Iranian elite thinks that it's best to have the capability of having a nuclear weapon in the long terms if once pushed to the corner. Now this sounds very sinister and dangerous, but there are about 30 countries in the world that have the capability of putting a nuclear weapon together. The typical example would be Japan. People say that Japan all needs is a long weekend to produce a weapon together. So technically it's not, Japan is not a nuclear state, but it could be if it wanted to. And there are plenty of other states that do it. And of course no one is proposing that US should attack every country, the 30 countries that have a capability in order to disarm. So that in a whole is the Iranian position. So when they say that they're not interested in a nuclear weapon, they're actually being honest. They're not interested in putting a weapon at hand, but what they want to have the scientists, they want to have the centrifuges, they want to have limited amount of uranium and the knowledge to be able to put those together if ever they need to do it. And this makes the common sense, and I think it's quite a rational, basically, perspective in terms of Iranian national interest. Now, for Israel and the Bush administration, this capability was intolerable. For them, the position was that Iran should have no nuclear program at all. Shouldn't have any nuclear scientists, shouldn't have any centrifuges, shouldn't have any enrichment. In fact, the Israeli policy was to assassinate as many Iranian physicists as they can. There's a whole series of scientists in Tehran have been assassinated really by Israel, and their bottom line is basically Iran should have no nuclear knowledge whatsoever, because that knowledge can become capability, and capability can eventually become a threat to Israel. And as long as the Bush administration supported that position, then obviously there was no possibility of a deal between Iran and the United States, because Iran, there was no way it was going to dismantle all its nuclear program. It had its national prestige attached to it. It had its security attached to it. So as long as that was the U.S. position, there was no way of coming to an agreement. So what has changed really is not the Iranian position, is the U.S. administration's position. Obama has been actually quite consistent even before he came to the White House. He made it clear that he was opposed to Iran having a nuclear weapons, but he was not opposed to Iran having a nuclear program. This was a clear distinction that he made, and it was a clear distinction he made between himself and the Bush administration. And having come to office, he basically was willing to pursue this. The first few years, it was hard to do it because the president in Iran was Ahmadinejad, who actually was willing to negotiate, but he had already so much baggage with him that it was very difficult with the Obama administration to take him seriously on the negotiation. Even that, there were actually quiet negotiations, secret negotiations in Oman with the Ahmadinejad administration. But when Rouhani was elected, then that was a nice opening for this administration to actually then step in and to make it clear that they were willing to tolerate an Iranian nuclear program as long as Iran gave guarantees that that nuclear program would not develop into a nuclear weapons program. So this has been actually quite consistent in Obama's policy. In other areas he may have been inconsistent, but on Iran he has been actually very consistent. Another thing about the Obama administration is a speech Obama made to the United Nations General Assembly in September last year, which can be actually billed as an Obama doctrine. It wasn't billed as such. There wasn't much publicity given to it. But it's a very interesting document where he actually spells out what are U.S. core interests. This is a phrase he constantly uses, core interests in the Middle East. And what's significant in that is he doesn't list things such as Israel as a core interest or megalomaniac notions of spreading democracy and so on. He very much limits core interests as American national interests in the region. And the two he stresses is one, the diplomatic settlement of the nuclear issue, and actually also mentions the settlement of the Palestinian issue as a U.S. core interest in the region. So with these basically changes in American foreign policy, it was obviously an opening for the Rouhani administration to offer another olive branch, which was of course quickly grabbed in the White House, and negotiations started for a settlement. And what the U.S. was demanding from Iran was of course verifiable guarantees, monitoring about the nuclear program, that the nuclear program wouldn't become a weapons program, which Iran is actually willing to give, and that's where basically the negotiations are on now. And I don't see any difficulties in that. Basically, they have the will to actually, or the desire to come to a settlement, so technical difficulties can easily be solved on that issue. The problem, of course, comes in Israel, and of course the representatives of AIPAC in the Congress. For Israel, their security rests in having no other country in the Middle East having nuclear capability. They want a monopoly of nuclear capability. And if Iran has that capability, that is perceived in the Netanyahu administration as a potential threat. So this brings basically a conflict of national interest between the United States and Israel. For U.S., it's not a threat to the United States if Iran has long-term capability. For Netanyahu's administration, the perception is that capability is a threat to Israel. So then the question becomes, whose policy should the United States pursue? Is it U.S. policy or Israeli policy? Well, there are obviously people in Congress who echo AIPAC and Israel and argued that basically no agreement is good agreement with Iran, that basically Iran should be forced to either capitulate or regime change, or basically sanctions increase until Iran dismantles all its nuclear program. And of course, this administration in Washington has come to the conclusion, I think rightfully, that no amount of pressure is going to force Iran to actually dismantle, and more pressure is not going to lead to regime change. In fact, another thing that I should have mentioned in the Obama's UN speech is he did deny any desire for regime change. So that's not on the table. It's not part of their program, which it had been in previous administrations in Washington. So congressmen who are echoing AIPAC are actually stepping on very thin ice. Because when it comes to push to the shove, the question is, whose interest should American foreign policy be? Should it be in U.S. foreign policy interest, or should it be in the Israeli foreign policy interest? You can say from the Israeli point of view, yes, Iran should not have the capability, but since it's not really the same for U.S. interest, then why should the U.S. get involved in a war when it's not in its interest to do so? So you have actually a strange situation where Israel and Saudi Arabia are volunteering U.S. to attack Iran. Well, if they want to really seriously attack Iran, why don't they do so themselves? Why should the United States be involved in such a war for their interest? And obviously from the U.S. point of view, which the U.S. president can argue if it comes to really be pushed to the shove, he can very well go to the public, American public, and say, here, this is our national interest. I'm a president. I'm espousing national interest. There are congressmen who then are not actually espousing American national interest. Who is the public going to support? So this is going to put very much congressmen in the corner, because they obviously would not want to go against U.S. president, especially their own Democratic president, on an issue that is of vital interest to the United States, but to go to war for the interests of some other country. We're actually coming to the 100th anniversary of 1914. One lesson historians and politicians learned, and more politicians have forgotten about the lesson of 1914, is that you don't let small allies run the policy of major powers, especially if small allies are trigger happy and eager to go to war. The lesson people learned from August 1914 is smaller allies dragged major powers into a war when it wasn't really in the interest of the major powers to do so. This was a very much a lesson my generation learned. It's now dropped out of the books, and congressmen, of course, don't know this lesson, but I think the White House and the occupant of the White House now very much knows about this. Well, why else would he stress so much in his UN speech about U.S. needing to follow core interests? And if it's not in the core interest of the United States to go to war, why should it go to war for the interests of some ally or some other country, especially if it's in the interests of Israel or Saudi Arabia? I'll stop there. No, I mean, I would like to stress from what Rust is saying is, the conclusion can be very pessimistic, because if Congress plays such an important role, however many phone calls we make, we're not going to compete with AIPAC. So AIPAC's policy is then basically no deal with Iran and even war. So that policy is going to win in Congress, however much noise we make. But if one looks at it in terms of national interest and what the president articulates as national interest, that is then going to put, I think, AIPAC and the war basically party in a corner. In the past, Israel could always say, well, Israeli interests are the same as U.S. interests, so there's no contradiction. But here, I think you are right. AIPAC has overstepped itself. Here, there is actually a clear-cut conflict between U.S. foreign interest and Israeli foreign interest. So are congressmen really going to represent American interests or Israeli interests or Saudi interests? On that point, I mean, I think this administration is willing to play hardball. If it comes to the crush, they can go to the political and talk about this is what the president articulates as U.S. interests. We need to have an agreement. The Iranians are willing to agree. So why shouldn't we agree because Israel doesn't want to agree? On that level, I think AIPAC will be put in a corner. One can also see indications from actually people in the foreign policy establishment that over the years they've got so actually angry at AIPAC over a host of issues that is also actually breaking basically taboos in Washington. You hear actually people from the Clinton administration, high-ranking people saying that there are two evil organizations in the United States. One is the NRA, the other is AIPAC. Now, this is not a man in the street saying that. This is how people, high senior officials from previous administrations. So when it comes to a question of especially war and national interest, this administration, I think, is willing to actually play very hardball with AIPAC on this issue.
But the issue, if I can just come back, I think we have I don't know if we have a principal difference. First of all, this administration has never played hardball on anything. I mean, there's not been a great track record in terms of its firmness. So I think, I don't feel like all magic resides there. I think there's a willingness to be tougher and stronger than they have been in the past. I think that that's the case. But Congress can easily tie them up. And my point is that we can defeat AIPAC. But the administration can't just do that by going on television. And they're not going to be as brazen as you think because, again, there's presidential election ahead and there's Florida and, so forth. So, I don't think it's correct to say, or maybe it's a difference of emphasis. I think the administration is willing to push, but I think we have to be willing to fight. And if there is not a grassroots mobilization with the Congress, then I actually do think we're going to lose. But I think we can win. But we're not going to win in a half-assed way. We're not going to win by just doing a little something and then doing 20 other things and forgetting about it. It really has to be a sustained effort. Most people in Brooklyn, for example, are clueless, right, about what their members of Congress do on this. Don't know anything. And so there's a whole job to be done. So I don't know if we really disagree, but I think it has to be, we're having movement at the top. I think that's great, but it's not enough. And I think the question is, is there an ability at the grassroots to really do some significant fight back? I don't know if we really disagree or...
Well, I mean, I'm more optimistic. Even if, let's say, Congress sabotages this deal, you have a U.S. president agreeing with the Iranian president that the deal is possible. Congress says no. Okay, so what happens? The U.S. no longer runs the world. The rest of the countries in the world are going to actually break the sanctions. The whole system is going to unravel. So here you have actually a question of political reality. This administration is much more in touch with limitations of American power. Congress lives in its own world. It really thinks that it can basically dictate to the rest of the world. In fact, I think in the Obama speech, it's one thing that it becomes clear. He stresses the limitations of U.S. power. In that way, I think that this is a very realistic assessment of it. Already, actually, countries like Britain are more than eager to break sanctions. They're running off to Iran to make deals. So if the U.S. president, the Iranian president, come to a deal, why should they listen to Congress and continue with sanctions? So it will actually unravel U.S. power if Congress tries to sabotage the president's position.
I think we all understand that the essential Israeli position is that there can be no theoretical possible basis for Iran to be able to have a nuclear weapon. There, as a peace group, let me say, I think that Brooklyn for Peace agrees, broadly stated, with the idea that no country should be having nuclear weapons. They are bad things, and we would like them to go away. That, of course, includes our country, Israel, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and the other nuclear powers. I mean, we think this across the board. So, we do know that this is the goal of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is a goal I think that all of us really do share. With that said, the fact is that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty allows for, quote, the peaceful, unquote, use of atomic energy, whatever that may really mean. And Iran, obviously, as a signatory to that treaty, is entitled to its own peaceful use of nuclear power, however misguided that may in fact be. The fact of the matter is, of course, that the treaty regime has made compatible this idea of you can be nuclear weapons ready with the idea of not having nuclear weapons. And that counts as nuclear disarmament. And I think we all agree it's going to be a difficult proposition to say that Iran should be treated just like any other country that has a nuclear capacity in this regard. And we're going to have a very difficult time given the interests of AIPAC, and it's our job as a peace organization to try to mobilize as much as we can in order to deal with that problem. And I think as Rusty indicated, part of the reason we're here tonight is that we are in a different period of time because we now have an administration that, however hesitantly and however, what should I say, diffidently, they are nevertheless pursuing a policy with Iran of actual diplomatic engagement. This is something that we've been calling for as a peace organization for a very long time, and it's something that we want to support. We need to do it on the most informed and best possible basis.
دامن کشان سایه میخوارم از کنار یارم دست و گیسو افشان میگریزم بر جان